The silver stallion appeared at dawn like liquid mercury against the amber wheat, and Quintus Harrington knew he had to possess it. Standing on the marble terrace of his sprawling Kentucky estate, the billionaire tech mogul lowered his Italian binoculars with trembling hands. In 37 years of collecting the world's most magnificent horses, he had never witnessed such raw beauty. The wild stallion moved with the fluid grace of wind itself, its coat shimmering like molten silver. In the morning light, every muscle rippled with untamed power as it led a small herd across the valley that bordered his property. Meridian, Quintus called to his stable master, never taking his eyes off the magnificent creature. "I want that horse." Meridian Colfax had worked for demanding men before, but Quintus Harrington took obsession to unprecedented levels. The man's climate-controlled stables housed 43 of the world's most expensive horses, each worth more than most people's homes. Arabian princes, racing champions, show jumpers with bloodlines stretching back centuries, all of them mere trophies. In Quintus' endless quest to own beauty itself. "Sir, that's wild land across the valley, old Barnaby Sweetwater's farm. Been in his family for generations, though I hear he's struggling something fierce these days." Quintus finally turned, his steel-grey eyes burning with the same intensity that had built his tech empire from nothing. "Find out everything about this Sweetwater family. Their debts, their weaknesses, their price. That stallion will be mine within the month." But across the valley, 17-year-old Clementine Sweetwater had no idea that her world was about to change forever. She knelt in the vegetable garden behind their weathered farmhouse, her calloused hands gentle as she tended to the struggling tomato plants. The morning mist still clung to the rolling hills, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the thunder of hooves. Her heart quickened, as it always did at that sound. The wild herd had been appearing more frequently lately, always at dawn, or dusk, always just beyond reach. Her father Barnaby claimed they were a nuisance, but Clementine felt drawn to them in ways she couldn't explain, especially to the silver stallion that seemed to watch her from afar with intelligent dark eyes. "Clemmy," her father's voice carried across the yard, rough with worry. "Come inside, girl. We need to talk." She found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by overdue bills and legal notices. At 52, Barnaby Sweetwater looked far older, his face weathered by decades of hard farming and recent years of financial struggle. The drought had been brutal, the crops poor, and the medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment had drained their savings completely. "Sweetheart," he began, his voice cracking. "A man called this morning, rich fellow from across the valley. Says he wants to buy our land." Clementine's world tilted. This farm was all she'd ever known, the only connection left to her mother who'd passed just 6 months ago. "Daddy, no. We can find another way. The bank's already started foreclosure." "Proceedings, Clemmy. This Harrington fellow is offering enough to pay our debts and give us a fresh start somewhere else." But as if summoned by her distress, the silver stallion appeared at their kitchen window, its noble head silhouetted against the morning sky. For a moment, girl and horse regarded each other through the glass, and Clementine felt something profound pass between them, a recognition, a promise, a destiny intertwining. The horse pawed the ground once, then vanished like smoke, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and a daughter's whispered vow. "I won't let them take everything." Quintus Harrington arrived at the Sweetwater farm 3 days later in a caravan of black SUVs that seemed to swallow the dusty country road. He emerged from the lead vehicle wearing a $1,000 suit that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of rusted farm equipment and weathered barns. Clementine watched from the porch as her father walked out to meet the billionaire, his shoulders squared with desperate dignity. She'd spent the past 3 days learning everything she could about Quintus Harrington, staying up late in the local library, reading articles about his business empire, his horse collection, and his reputation for getting exactly what he wanted. Mr. Sweetwater, Quintus extended a manicured hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I believe we can help each other." What followed was less a negotiation than a siege. Quintus laid out his offer with the precision of a corporate takeover. $3 million for the Sweetwater land, enough to pay off all debts with money left over for a comfortable retirement. All he wanted in return was the deed and one additional consideration. "The wild horses that roam your property," Quintus said, his eyes gleaming. "I want them captured and transferred to my facilities, particularly the silver stallion, Clementine's." Blood ran cold. She stepped off the porch, ignoring her father's warning look. "Those horses aren't ours to sell. They're wild. They belong to themselves." Quintus studied her with the calculating gaze he usually reserved for business rivals. The girl was clearly poor. Her clothes were mended, her boots worn, but there was something in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of his own determination. "Miss Sweetwater, I presume. Everything has a price, including freedom. I'm prepared to pay handsomely for the privilege of preserving those magnificent creatures in proper facilities." "Preserving?" Clementine's voice rose. "You mean imprisoning? Those horses have run free for generations. You can't just lock them away like trophies." "I can, and I will." Quintus' mask of politeness slipped for a moment, revealing the steel beneath. "Your father has already agreed to my terms." Clementine turned to Barnaby, her heart breaking at the defeat in his eyes. She understood his impossible position: take the money and save what was left of their family legacy, or lose everything to the bank within weeks. That night, as her father signed the contracts in the lamplight, Clementine slipped out to the fields where she'd often seen the wild herd. The silver stallion was waiting for her, as if he'd known she would come. Up close, he was even more magnificent, nearly 17 hands tall, with a coat that seemed to capture and reflect moonlight. "They want to cage you," she whispered, approaching. "Slowly, but I won't let that happen." The stallion allowed her to come near, something he'd never done before. When she reached out her hand, he touched his velvet muzzle to her palm, and she felt the warmth of his breath, the trust he was offering her. "We need to leave," she told him. "Both of us, before they come for you." As if he understood, the stallion nudged her shoulder, then knelt in the dewy grass. Heart pounding with the audacity of what she was about to do, Clementine climbed onto his back. He rose with fluid grace, and suddenly they were flying across the moonlit fields, her hair streaming behind her, his hooves drumming a rhythm of freedom against the earth. When they returned to the farm hours later, Clementine had made her decision. Quintus Harrington could buy their land, but he would never own the spirit that lived here. The silver stallion had chosen her, and she had chosen him. Tomorrow, when the billionaire came to claim his prize, he would find that some treasures could never be bought. She slid down from the stallion's back and pressed her forehead to his neck. "I'll call you Sterling," she whispered, "and I promise you'll never know a cage." The horse whickered softly in response, then melted back into the darkness, carrying with him the hopes of a girl who had just declared war on the richest man in 3 counties. The capture operation began at sunrise, and Sterling was nowhere to be found. Quintus stood in the middle of what had been the Sweetwater farm. his jaw tight with barely controlled fury as his team of professional horse wranglers returned empty-handed for the third consecutive day. The other wild horses had been captured easily enough. A dozen mares and geldings now resided in his pristine stables, looking miserable despite their luxurious accommodations. But the silver stallion had vanished as if he'd never existed. "Impossible," Quintus muttered, studying the aerial drone footage on his tablet. "Horses don't simply disappear." His head wrangler, a weathered cowboy named Jasper Kane, shook his head grimly. "That stallion's smarter than any horse I've tracked, boss. It's like he knows our every move before we make it." What Jasper didn't know was that Sterling did know their every move. Clementine had been tracking the search teams from the forest's edge, using her intimate knowledge of the land to stay one step ahead. She'd grown up exploring every hidden cave, every forgotten trail, every secret place in these hills. Now she led Sterling through a network of sanctuaries that no outsider could ever find. They had been living rough for 3 days, sleeping in abandoned shepherds' huts, drinking from mountain streams, surviving on wild berries and the few supplies she'd managed to grab before fleeing. Sterling seemed to understand their situation with an intelligence that continued to astound her. He stayed silent when voices approached, followed her through treacherous mountain paths without hesitation, and somehow always seemed to know which direction led to safety. But their luck couldn't hold forever. There, the shout echoed across the valley as one of Quintus' men spotted them at a ridgeline. The girl and the horse northeast ridge. Sterling's ears flattened as the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. 2 aircrafts appeared over the tree line, their downdraft whipping Clementine's hair as searchlights swept the ground below. She pressed herself against Sterling's neck as he picked his way down a steep ravine, his hooves finding purchase on loose stones that would have sent a lesser horse tumbling. "Where can we go?" she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the mechanical thunder above. "They're everywhere." As if in answer, Sterling changed direction, heading deeper into the wilderness than they'd ever ventured. The terrain grew rougher, more hostile, but the stallion moved with unshakable confidence through landscapes that seemed primordial and untouched. They climbed for hours, following deer trails and stream tees, until they reached a place Clementine had never seen before, hidden valley surrounded by towering cliffs, accessible only through a narrow canyon that could easily be missed. Ancient pines stretched toward the sky, and a crystal stream meandered through meadows dotted with wildflowers. It was like stepping into a fairy tale. "How did you know about this place?" she asked Sterling, sliding down from his back to rest by the stream. The horse's only answer was to lower his head and drink deeply. But Clementine noticed something else: hoofprints in the soft earth, old ones, weathered by seasons. This wasn't just a random hiding place. This was home to something. Her answer came at sunset, when Sterling lifted his head and called out in a voice that echoed off the canyon walls. The sound that answered him made Clementine's heart stop. It wasn't just one horse, it was many, and they were coming closer. The first to emerge from the tree line was a black mare, her coat gleaming like obsidian in the fading light. Behind her came others, a dozen wild horses of every color imaginable, their eyes bright with intelligence and wariness. They moved like liquid shadow through the meadow, and Clementine realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. This was Sterling's true herd. Not the small band that had grazed near her father's farm, but a massive family of wild horses that had somehow remained hidden from the world. The black mare approached Sterling with obvious affection, nuzzling his neck while the others formed a protective circle around them. You brought me to your sanctuary, Clementine whispered, understanding, flooding through her. This is why you could never be captured. You belong to something bigger than any one person could own. But even as she marveled at the sight, the sound of helicopters grew closer. Quintus Harrington had resources that most people could barely imagine, and his obsession with Sterling had only grown stronger with each day the horse remained free. The hunt was far from over, and Clementine realized they would need more than just a hidden valley to escape the billionaire's reach. They would need a miracle. Clementine awoke to find herself surrounded by horses and humans alike. The hidden valley had filled overnight with an unlikely assembly, members of the local Shoshone tribe, environmental activists, wildlife photographers, and even some of Quintus' own former stable hands, who had quit in disgust over his obsessive pursuit. Word of Sterling's story had somehow spread beyond the valley, carried by social media posts, news reports, and the kind of grassroots network that forms when people witness something worth protecting. At the center of it all stood Winifred Clearwater, a tribal elder whose weathered face held a lifetime of wisdom. She approached Clementine with deliberate steps, her eyes taking in both girl and stallion with obvious recognition. The silver horse has been in our stories for 7 generations, Winifred said, her voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. We called him the Spirit Runner, the one who would appear when the balance was threatened. My grandmother saw him once, during the drought of 1934. My great-great-grandmother spoke of him during the cavalry raids. Clementine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You're saying Sterling is ... the same horse? No, child, I'm saying he carries the same spirit, the same purpose. These mountains have always been home to horses like him, wild ones, who serve as guardians of something precious that civilization keeps trying to destroy. Around them, the impromptu camp buzzed with activity. Dr. Helena Morrison, a wildlife biologist from the university, was documenting the hidden herd with meticulous care. Her preliminary count revealed over 60 horses, representing bloodlines that had somehow remained pure and wild despite centuries of human encroachment. This is unprecedented, Dr. Morrison told the gathering. These horses represent genetic diversity that we thought was lost forever. They're not just beautiful, they're irreplaceable. But beauty and scientific importance meant nothing to Quintus Harrington. His helicopters circled the valley like mechanical vultures, and his lawyers had already served papers claiming the hidden sanctuary as part of his expanded property rights. Money, it seemed, could buy even the most remote wilderness if you knew which officials to pressure. He's got judges in his pocket, reported Jameson Pike, an environmental lawyer who had driven up from Denver. Claims of ancestral territory, scientific preservation, even wildlife protection laws. He's finding ways around all of them. We're dealing with someone who sees law as just another commodity to be purchased. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the valley, Sterling did something extraordinary. He approached each group in turn, the tribal members, the scientists, the activists, and somehow communicated with them in ways that transcended language. A touch of his muzzle here, a meaningful look there, a gentle nudge that seemed to say, trust. He's asking for help, Clementine realized, watching the stallion's interactions, not just for himself, but for all of them. She gestured toward the wild herd, now grazing peacefully among their human protectors. Winifred nodded. Spirit animals choose their allies carefully. He brought you here not just for sanctuary, but to build something stronger than any one person's. Wealth, the old woman was right. Over the next few hours, the disparate groups began organizing with remarkable efficiency. The tribal council invoked ancient territorial rights. Dr. Morrison contacted her network of conservation biologists. The activists started a social media campaign that spread across the internet like wildfire. Even some of Quintus' own employees began leaking information about his ruthless collection practices, but the billionaire's response was swift and overwhelming. By dawn, the valley's single entrance was blocked by private security forces. Quintus himself arrived in his personal helicopter, landing in the meadow with the arrogance of a conquering general. "This has gone far enough," he announced, his voice carrying across the valley through a portable amplifier. "I have legal ownership of this land and everything on it. Anyone who doesn't leave immediately will be arrested for trespassing." Sterling stepped forward, placing himself between Quintus and the assembled crowd. The morning sun caught his silver coat, making him look like he was forged from pure light. For a moment, the two faced each other, billionaire and stallion. Ownership and freedom, civilization and wildness. "Beautiful," Quintus whispered, his obsession naked in his voice. "Absolutely beautiful, and mine." But Sterling's response was to rear up on his hind legs, a magnificent display of defiance that seemed to shake the very mountains. His call echoed off the canyon walls, answered by every horse in the valley, wild and domestic alike. The sound was primal, powerful, and utterly uncompromising. The battle for Sterling's freedom was about to begin. The siege of the Hidden Valley lasted 3 days, and Clementine watched Quintus Harrington reveal his true nature with each passing hour. On the first day, he tried reason, offering increasingly absurd sums of money to anyone who would help him capture Sterling. When that failed, he brought in veterinarians with tranquilizer guns, only to discover that the horses had vanished into cave systems that honeycombed the valley, walls hiding places that Winifred's ancestors had used for centuries. On the second day, he escalated to intimidation. Federal marshals arrived with questionable warrants. Environmental officials appeared with suspicious safety violations for the impromptu camp. Reporters found themselves facing lawsuits for covering the story. But for every official Quintus bought, 2 more seemed to appear in support of the wild herd. By the 3rd day, the valley had become the center of a national controversy. News crews ringed the perimeter. Celebrity activists flew in from Los Angeles. Congress members made statements about corporate overreach and environmental protection. The hashtag freedom for Sterling trended worldwide, accompanied by photographs of the magnificent stallion that somehow captured something essential about the American spirit. Through it all, Sterling remained calm, as if he understood that this confrontation was bigger than just his own freedom. He stayed close to Clementine, allowing her to draw strength from his presence as they faced down a man who seemed determined to own the entire world. The end came suddenly, triggered by an act of desperation that revealed the depth of Quintus' obsession. Just after dawn, while most of the camp still slept, the billionaire made his move. Using a path his security team had scouted during the night, he approached Sterling's position alone, carrying a high-tech capture collar designed for dangerous wildlife. His plan was simple: get close enough to activate the device, then extract the horse before anyone could interfere. Clementine sensed the danger before she saw it, jolted awake by Sterling's sudden tension. The stallion stood motionless, every muscle coiled for action, staring at something in the pre-dawn shadows. She followed his gaze and saw Quintus creeping across the meadow, the collar glowing faintly in his hands. "No," she whispered, but Sterling was already moving. What happened next became legend. captured by dozens of cameras and cell phones as the camp erupted into wakefulness. Sterling didn't flee instead. He charged directly at Quintus, not to attack, but to demonstrate something that no amount of money could buy. The stallion stopped just inches from the billionaire, close enough that Quintus could have activated the collar with a simple gesture. For a moment, man and horse stood frozen in tableau, representing two completely different ways of seeing the world. Then Sterling did something extraordinary. He lowered his magnificent head and gently nuzzled Quintus' hand knots in submission. But in offering, the collar clattered to the ground as the billionaire's hands began to shake. "I could have had you," Quintus whispered, his voice breaking. "Right now, I could have everything I wanted." Sterling's response was to step back and call to his herd. They emerged from their hiding places like ghosts materializing from mist 60 horses moving in perfect harmony, surrounding the billionaire in a circle of wild beauty, not threatening him, simply showing him what freedom looked like when it was freely given. Clementine approached slowly, seeing something she'd never expected in Quintus Harrington's eyes: tears. "When did you last see something beautiful that you didn't try to own?" she asked gently. The question seemed to shatter something inside the billionaire. He sank to his knees in the dewy grass, surrounded by horses who could have been his butt, chose instead to simply be themselves. For 37 years, he had collected beauty like a man trying to fill a bottomless pit, never understanding that the act of possession destroyed the very thing he sought. "I don't remember," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't remember the last time I saw something beautiful without calculating its price." Sterling approached again, this time allowing Quintus to stroke his neck. The touch seemed to complete some circuit between them, and when the billionaire finally stood, he was somehow a different man. "The contracts," Quintus said, turning to face the assembled crowd. "All of them, consider them void. The land goes back to the Sweetwater family. The captured horses return to the wild, and this valley." He looked around at the hidden sanctuary with something approaching reverence. "This valley becomes a protected preserve, funded in perpetuity." The cheer that went up could probably be heard for miles, but Clementine barely noticed. She was watching Sterling, who had moved to stand beside her with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Somehow, the stallion had accomplished what lawyers and activists couldn't. He had reminded a man what it meant to witness beauty without needing to own it. 6 months later, Clementine sat on the porch of the rebuilt Sweetwater farmhouse, watching Sterling graze in the pasture with the freedom to come and go as he pleased. The transformation had been remarkable. Quintus Harrington had kept his word with the same obsessive thoroughness he'd once applied to collecting horses. The Sterling Valley Preserve now encompassed 12,000 acres of protected wilderness, complete with research facilities for Dr. Morrison's ongoing studies of wild horse genetics. The original Sweetwater farm had been restored and expanded, becoming headquarters for what was now one of the country's most successful wild horse sanctuaries. More importantly, Quintus himself had undergone a metamorphosis that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of collecting horses, he now funded their protection. Instead of caging beauty, he created spaces where it could flourish. He visited the valley regularly, often sitting for hours just watching the wild herds, learning to find satisfaction in observation rather than ownership. "I never thanked you properly," he said to Clementine during one of these visits, his designer suits now replaced by practical outdoor gear. "Sterling didn't just show me what I was trying to steal. He showed me what I'd been stealing from myself. All these years." Clementine smiled, Remembering the broken man who had knelt in the meadow surrounded by horses he finally understood he could never truly own. Sterling has a way of teaching people what they need to learn. As if summoned by his name, the silver stallion appeared at the fence line, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Over the months, he had grown even more magnificent, his wild nature enhanced rather than diminished by the security of the preserve. He had become the unofficial ambassador of the sanctuary, somehow knowing which visitors needed his particular brand of wisdom. A group of children from the local school was touring the facility that day, and Sterling approached the fence with the gentle patience he always showed to young ones. Their guide, a former stable hand of Quintus named Cooper Nash, explained how the stallion had once been hunted by men who wanted to cage him. "But why didn't they just leave him alone?" asked a little girl with pigtails. Cooper glanced at Clementine, who had joined the group. "Sometimes people think that loving something means owning it," he explained. "But Sterling taught us that real love means setting things free to be what they're meant to be." The children nodded solemnly, somehow understanding this profound truth, with the clarity that only childhood can provide. One little boy reached through the fence to stroke Sterling's neck, and the stallion stood perfectly still, allowing the contact with regal grace. Later that evening, as the preserve settled into its twilight quiet, Clementine walked out to the meadow where Sterling grazed with his herd. The wild horses had multiplied under protection, and now nearly 80 magnificent animals called the valley home. They moved like living poetry across the landscape, free to run as far and as fast as their spirits demanded. "You did it," she told Sterling, running her fingers through his silver mane. "You saved yourself and all of them." The stallion's response was to toss his head toward the mountains, where the last light of day painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Then, with a gentle nudge to her shoulder that had become their private goodbye ritual, he cantered away to rejoin his family. Clementine watched him go, her heart full of the kind of contentment that comes from witnessing a miracle. Sterling had taught them all that some treasures become more valuable when they're shared, that some beauty grows brighter when it's free, and that the most precious things in life are the ones that can never be only admired, protected, and loved from a respectful distance. The wild horses of Sterling Valley ran beneath the stars that night, their hoofbeats drumming a rhythm of freedom that echoed through the mountains and into the dreams of everyone who had learned to see the difference between possession and appreciation, between capture and care, between owning beauty and being blessed by it in the end. The millionaire who had wanted every horse discovered that the greatest treasure was simply being allowed to witness their wild perfection, understanding at last that love and liberty were not opposites, but partners in the dance of life itself.